All right. So, with that general framing question aside, I think I mentioned in class that I want to talk about San Junipero a little more in terms of narrative structure and thinking of it a little more through writer brain than critic brain. Um, I think it opens up a lot in on both fronts, but I want to talk about the sort of overall narrative structure of it, and I would kind of break this piece into four narrative pieces, um, and I mean I'm going to be sort of simplistic about it. We have the first, let's call it act, and that is that is really just establishing an environment and establishing a sort of emotional premise, establishing the early part of the relationship between Kelly and Yorkie, um, and establishing character. So really, the first part is driven by character. There is not, there are hints that something is off. There are moments um, where like literally a chord gets struck in the soundtrack that draws us attention to something odd about the way people are talking, the way people are acting. But these moments don't quite uh, tell us what's going on. And I'm going to talk more about um, references and um, how this show is really meant to be watched multiple times. But let's just say, let's imagine it on a first viewing, um, and you're watching the first act, and what you're seeing is really like two people who meet at a club, and eventually like become romantically involved. So that's sort of the first act. The second act is where Yorkie is looking for Kelly again, and this act is kind of defined by the increasing sense of disorientation, um, where now the environment which we've been introduced to is no longer stable. There are the switches of years. There's the move to the quagmire, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and we're seeing more of the premise sort of leak in, and these you know the switch to midnight becomes more pronounced. I think that's almost where the move from first act to second act happens, is when they're together and they watch the clock turn, and we cut away to a week later. But the second act is this moment of like disorientation where we as the audience are sort of, we're feeling alienated, we're feeling unstable in the environment, and then we get to the point where um, the characters sort of resolve this, and that moves into the third act, and the third act is really Kelly, older Kelly in the real world, going to find Yorkie, and and the sort of lead up, the I would say the fourth act is becomes almost a coda, but the third act is this where the big implications of what's going on play out, where we're getting really like sort of philosophical discussions about why one would or would not enter into this enter into like sign up to go into San Junipero after death, and it's where the show is at its strongest. It's where Charlie Brooker as a writer is at his strongest, is like really bringing together emotional impact and sort of philosophical questions about technology, and joining those, and that's the third act. And then the fourth act is that sort of resolution moment that happens um, like sort of through the credits. We get Kelly's death, and then the sort of resolution that she has decided to pass over into San Junipero. So that's the basic narrative structure, and I just want to lay that out. So we have establishment of environment, we have establishment of emotional premise and of characters. And in that first act, we're not necessarily in a sci-fi text. We don't have the feeling that we're in a sci-fi text. We're not, except that we sat down to watch it. We're not hyper aware of it, and it goes on for long enough that we might actually lose that sense that something science fictional is going on. second act is that that section of disorientation where the premise is starting, the sci-fi premise, the novum, is starting to come to the fore, and the world is has stopped working in the way that we think that it ought to. And then that, if the first act um, ends with the really disorienting cut from them in bed to a week later at midnight, the second act, I think, leads up to and ends with the decision for Kelly to find Yorkie in the real world, and the explicit stating that this is not the real world. And then we move into the third act, which is the emotional implications, emotional and philosophical implications of the novum, of the technology that we've been introduced to, and then the fourth act, which is the resolution of the emotional plot. So that's the basic structure, and now that I've laid that out in a way that's really clear, I'm going to switch over and make it weirder.